Good morning, everyone. My name is Kay Jacobson. I'm a librarian with the Ramsey County Libraries, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our ongoing Great Decision series. Um, Today's program is on Ukraine and the future of European security. It is brought to us by Norma Noonan, who has a PhD in, first, long bio here I'm going to go through. Norma is a professor emerita of political science and leadership studies at Augsburg College. She is the former director of the Master of Arts in Leadership program there. She's an expert in comparative and international politics and leadership studies with special interests in Russia, women in society, and leadership theories. Ms. Noonan is a frequent lecturer and commentator in the Twin Cities and has authored over 50 articles and contributed to various anthologies and readers. She is editor and contributor to the Encyclopedia of Russian Women's Movements and the co-editor and contributor to Russian Women in Politics and Society. She's also a contributor to a book on emerging powers. Wow, this has to be updated, Norma, because I'm like going, this has
They
been a while.
haven't updated it. Yeah, yeah,
So, but I know you've done more since then, because this is
yes, that's
you're
been
just
updated.
you are prolific. Norma earned a PhD and a Master of um, Arts in Political Science from Indiana University, a certificate in Russian and Eastern European Studies from Indiana University, and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Pennsylvania. She's an avid traveler and most recently she's traveled to Russia and Central Europe among, I'm sure, numerous other places. You can always update us on that, Norma, but I also want to thank today's co-sponsors. This is made possible through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota, through the Ramsey County Library, through Global Minnesota, and the Foreign Policy Association. Without all of these great organizations, this wouldn't be possible. So we are thankful to all of them. With that said, I think we're ready to go, Norma. I'm going to hand things over to you.
Good. Thank you so much, Kay, for your gracious introduction. And I think that that biography needs to be updated. I haven't done it lately. I keep saying, use the old one. So now I will wait a second. I'll change to share and we'll go from there. Okay. Good. Well, thank you, everyone. And I would enjoyed the music before the presentation. This is a special thing. The music added a lot of flavor. Okay. The topic in this year's Great Decisions book is to some extent a continuation of a 2025 Great Decisions topic, which was NATO, European security, and the US. And this year they just put it Ukraine and the future of European security. I lectured on the topic last year, and so I want to make a little bit of a transition, and we'll reference a few points from that. However, this year we face very, very different circumstances. This topic was a complex one before the launching of 2026, but the Iran war has changed the context and the international relationships. Global attention, especially US attention, has moved away from Ukraine and Europe. And so I am planning to review the current complex relationship of European security and Ukraine in the current climate and the likely consequences. And also, then, if you're interested, I'm going to give a short lecture on the background of Russia and Ukraine so you can better understand the historical context of that ongoing conflict. Thus, I am tweaking the topic slightly, looking at changing global circumstances, how they have affected the Ukraine, US, European security issues, and a bit of background on the Russian-Ukraine war. I hope this will all interest you. Okay. Now, for those of you who use the Great Decisions book, and that would only be some of you, but you probably all have access to it one way or another through the library. Great Decisions topics are chosen 1 to 2 years ahead. And probably the research and the writing of the essays is finished by early in the prior years. So this year's essays probably were written sometime in early 2025. And at the latest by the summer of 2025. So this year's book could be prepared and printed by January of 2026. And over the years, I've been lecturing in Great Decisions for many, many years, more than I care to tell you. So that sometimes what appears to be a hot topic in year 1 will not be a hot topic by year 2 when the actual book is published. It doesn't happen that often, but it happened with this topic. The sequence was logical, given that the 2025 topic dealt with an aspect of the same issue. And the author who was chosen to write the chapter thought that the Ukraine war would continue as it appeared in early 2025, but things have changed. He posited 2 alternatives. One would be that Russia would win, and there would be consequences for Ukraine, for a diminished Ukraine in particular. And then he posited an interesting alternative that Ukraine would win and would serve in Eastern Europe in the same way that Israel serves in the Middle East, a feisty, determined country that will survive at all costs. It was a good exercise to propose these 2 alternatives. And I've always liked that style, to propose alternative futures. But circumstances have changed. The events of early 2026, and especially the war with Iran, have changed global conditions very fundamentally, and we have to deal with that. Ukraine and Russia, and even some of the European security issues, have been pushed into the background for the moment, especially for the makers of U.S. foreign policy. Thus, when the topic was chosen, the emphasis was on Ukraine as a factor in overall Europe-U.S. relations. The focus actually was on Europe-U.S. relations and how Ukraine could influence or would influence both European security and Western support for Ukraine. It assumed, as did we all in early 2025, that no immediate crises elsewhere in the world would affect the Europe-U.S. Ukraine-Russia situation. Well, other crises have intervened, most notably the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. In the short run, the Iran war has meant less that U.S. attention has moved from the war in Europe, which in turn means much less pressure on Russia. In the short run, Russia is a clear winner in terms of the Russian-Ukrainian continuing conflict. The focus on the Middle East means that aid to Ukraine has diminished and will diminish from all sources, especially the U.S., but also perhaps Europe. The U.S. has not dedicated any new money to Ukraine, but Europe continues to give, and indeed yesterday, just yesterday, exactly, Europe has agreed on a very major loan to Ukraine that had been held up because Hungary had exercised a veto on it. And now, with Orban's defeat, he has conceded and lifted his veto. So the aid is going to go through. And that is just overnight, very, very recent. The Iran war has also put more pressure on fragile US, Europe, NATO relations in general. Thus, in my mind, Putin emerges as a short-term winner in the evolving drama for two major reasons. Number one, US attention has shifted. And number two, the US is giving virtually no aid to Ukraine, and actually can add a third reason, which is the United States has lifted some restrictions on Russian oil. So that brings more revenue to Russia. So a combination of all of these, we could actually say three reasons, yes. Let's look a little bit at background. The evolving US administrations and their relationship to Europe generally. In the last 30 to 40 years, our presidential administrations have shifted in their interest and emphasis on European security. Let's just stick to the last 25, 26 years. The George W. Bush administration seemed to consult Europe less and assume Europe would follow a US lead. So we were not known during that time for consultation with Europe before we acted. We just assumed Europe would go along. The Obama administration turned its attention to other parts of the world while assuming the continuation of European ties. They didn't try to break the European ties, but they turned our focus elsewhere. The first Trump administration questioned Europe's commitment to the US and NATO, but did not do much to change. The Biden administration kept the traditional ties with NATO and Europe without any major new initiatives. And the current administration, Trump second administration, again questions our ties with NATO and Europe. Let's look more closely at the second Trump administration and Europe. The first Trump administrations had questions about Europe and NATO, but nothing much changed in a basic way. Trump was able to force Europe to commit to spending at least 2.5% of GDP on defense. Now Trump has insisted on 5% of GDP on defense, and the countries are slowly acquiescing to that. The second administration is perhaps more forceful in expressing its dissatisfaction, often using the word freeloading on the part of Europe. I would argue that historically, great powers have always subsidized lesser powers over which they have influence. That is the price for maintaining their influence over lesser powers. That is not unique, or that is not new. That is the price of power. Power costs. Power is not free. When NATO started, the United States was the only country capable of supporting the group. The immediate goal was to prevent Russia from gaining control over Western Europe, since between 1945 and 1949, Russia had consolidated control in Eastern Europe. Several countries were at risk in 1948-49, including France and Italy, where communists could have come to power through the ballot box, didn't even need a Russian troops. The ballot box would have done it. Over the years, as other countries recovered from World War II, they often or normally invested their energy into building up healthcare and other benefits, so that the more advanced countries of Europe are ahead of the United States in these efforts, in part because they didn't have to spend much on defense. We spent the money on defense, and they got all kinds of welfare benefits. I'd like to raise a question with you. What do we mean by European security? This sounds like a dumb question, but it is not an easy question, nor is there an easy answer. Some assume that it means the total of European population and the total number of troops. No. There are small armies in each country subject only to that state. There is no overall European security force except for the NATO nations when they are united. Those who argue Europe should provide for its own security tend to do simple addition and forget that there are separate governments and separate societies. Depending on how we count, there are 44 to 50 countries in Europe, 44 that are totally in Europe, and 6 that are partly in Europe and partly in Asia or the Middle East. 30 of these are in NATO. And if you're interested in finding out which countries are which, I would send you to Wikipedia or any other online source to check that out. So what does European security mean? Security for NATO members, that's 30 of the 50. Security outside of NATO, that's up to 30 countries more. Does European security mean Europe's ability to defend itself? Does it mean Europe's reliance on the US? What will it mean if the US withdraws partially or fully? These are all relevant questions to think about. If not today, then sometime. Let's turn to support for Ukraine. I'll start with American support for Ukraine since the war started in 2022, okay, and pre-2025. While a majority of Americans favored Ukraine in the Ukraine-Russian conflict, support varied in strength and commitment within the government. During the first 2 to 3 years of the current war, through January 2025, it was clear that Republicans were less committed to Ukraine than were Democrats. This was evident in congressional votes on Ukraine and in speeches by members of Congress. Trump was among the Republicans with less interest in Ukraine, perhaps even foremost among the Republicans with less interest in Ukraine. So when the Trump victory occurred in November 2024, we assumed US interest in Ukraine would decline. And I can remember lecturing on Ukraine and the Ukrainian war in the fall of 2024 before the election. And even as I lectured, I was thinking to myself, how is all of this going to change if Trump wins? Because I knew that from speeches, from presentations, etc., it was clear that we were probably at that time going through the last major aid commitment to Ukraine. And that proved to be true. Okay. Trump came to power in January 2025. In February, Zelensky came to the White House, and there was a very famous meeting in the White House that was televised. And it, in broad terms, told us the posture of the Trump administration. It turned into a televised humiliation of Zelensky, if you remember it. I'm sure some of you saw it because it was featured very widely, and you probably can go back and look at it on YouTube or something. Okay. Zelensky, in retrospect, made a serious error as he started that meeting. And he didn't know at the time that it would be an error, but it was an error. He did not start the meeting by thanking the United States for all its past aid. Now, he had made something like 22 speeches thanking the United States, but he didn't thank the United States that day. And so Trump accused him of not being grateful for American aid. By the end of that meeting, which went from bad to worse, he had been humiliated, and essentially talks ended for a time, not very long time, because he soon came back and thanked the United States profusely, and talks resumed. But that day, which is recorded, might say, because it was televised, stood out. I refer to that as the February 2025 model, because that model was repeated a number of times, namely to have a top leader meet with the president, the secretary of state, and one or two other people to discuss important world issues. A couple of weeks after the Zelensky meeting, there was a meeting with Netanyahu. Well, Netanyahu, who is shrewd, brilliant, whatever, opens the meeting with profuse thanks to the United States for all its aid. Nobody prompted him. He just opened with that. And I noticed that subsequent leaders, and there were a number of them, that came for less publicized meetings when it were televised, also opened with profuse thanks to the United States. And these televised meetings, which were held quite often in 2025, had a specific model that they followed. The leader would sit normally to the right of Trump, and Trump would sit on his left, and they would be facing the camera. To Trump's left would be J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and then another cabinet official, depending on the agenda of the cabinet official that was most affected by the agenda of that day. There have been fewer of these, but since 2026, and partly it's because of the war that has intervened. But this is a kind of a model to look for. It will be interesting to see whether it is used when King Charles comes. Now, King Charles, of course, is not a political leader. He is the ceremonial head of Great Britain, but not the political leader of Great Britain. So it'd be interesting to see whether it's used for that model is used for King Charles or not. Okay. Throughout 25 and continuing into 2026, the Trump administration has made it clear they want cooperation from Europe, but on American terms. And there have been numerous kinds of challenges. The most substantial of those has been the request that the European members of NATO contribute at least 5% of GDP to defense. And that is both for infrastructure and for weapons. Okay. Most countries have now agreed. Another challenge was the US demand that Denmark cede Greenland to the United States. This is an unprecedented kind of challenge in that it is a threat to a NATO country from another NATO country. And that has been abated for the present, but I doubt that it has gone away. Also, the threat of leaving NATO has been raised by the Trump administration. And my guess is that that was not a serious threat, but one that has been raised as a kind of a warning. Let's look at U.S. and Ukraine aid up to 2026. The U.S. has unquestionably provided significant aid to Ukraine in the years since the war began or resumed in 2022. Trump cut back on aid, first citing Ukrainian corruption, then saying that Europe was not contributing as much as the United States. And for that, he was corrected by the European leaders, most especially by Macron, who stopped him in the middle of a sentence with great courage, I think, and said, Europe is giving a lot of aid, not just loans. And he offered the data right then and there, televised. Trump ended these arguments, but argued then his next argument was that Europe should be the primary source of aid for Ukraine. So he's had three different arguments: Ukrainian corruption, Europe is not giving enough, and then Europe should be the primary one. Now, aid figures are very, very tricky. Okay. So I'm going to give you some, and they may sound contradictory, and they may be contradictory. But as of June 2025, US and Europe had each committed over 65 billion in material goods and training. In support of financial support and humanitarian aid, Europe had given 92 billion versus US 43 billion. Now, there are many, many other ways to count, but overall, prior to yesterday, Europe had given more. Each was close to 200 billion, however, all types of aid, humanitarian aid, weapons, etc. But figures are slippery. Now, that having been said, where does Ukraine stand in the Ukrainian-Russian war? Opinions will vary, but I will give you mine. At best, Ukraine is holding off the Russians. Russia has control over about 20% of Ukraine if you look at the way the country was created in 1995 when it gained independence from the USSR. Crimea was taken over by Russia in 2014. More about Crimea later. It holds most of the Donbass, that's 4 provinces in the eastern part of Ukraine, which are historically Russian-speaking areas. Okay. There are attacks by the Russians all over the country, often attacks of infrastructure and power stations, and also civilian homes. Both sides have lost significant numbers of men. Statistics are unreliable. It is believed that the Russians have lost more men in the war, but they have more to lose. Plus, they have used both foreign mercenaries and North Korean soldiers in the war. Estimates vary, but it's suggested that the Russians have perhaps lost 1 million men. Ukrainian statistics are even harder to get than the Russian statistics and vary from 250,000 men to 1 million men. There are even some Ukrainian statistics that suggest something only in the nature of 40 to 50,000, but you could forget those. Those are not accurate. The Ukrainians have developed in this war a small, relatively inexpensive drone that is so good that foreign countries, including the United States and Middle Eastern countries in the present conflict, are buying them for use in the war in the Middle East. The drone has garnered a lot of effectiveness. So in some senses, Ukraine has developed a small independent defense industry during this war. Recently, the News Hour on PBS had a whole segment highlighting the little drones, March 27, by the way, if you want to look that up with Passport membership or any other means that you have of accessing old programs on PBS. Thus, where does the war stand now? I have a slide on the war. It's not easy to see, so just look at the colors. The colors will tell us everything. Here is a map of the war, and the map is supposedly 1225, but it hasn't changed that much. Yellow is is essentially the core of Ukraine. Okay. Dark pink here, where if my arrow is dark pink, is areas of Ukraine held by Russia, and that includes the Crimea and the Donbass, the 4 provinces here. Okay. Some areas of Russia that Ukraine has made inroads into are shown in blue. But I doubt that these would be given to Ukraine in any settlement. They are holding them in part then. If you are a map buff and like to follow these situations on maps, Google map of the Ukraine-Russian war, and you will find good sources. One is the Institute for the Study of War, and that was the one that I just used, that you just saw, which had the blue and the red coloring. Okay. The BBC, Sky News, and also Al Jazeera is good. But search online for territory held by Russia in the Russian-Ukrainian war or map of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Either will get you the results. Right. Now coming to the present. Following the start of the Iran war, there are currently no negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, led by the United States. Zelensky requested some, but it has been ignored. Okay. Russia has been emboldened. There have been several major attacks on Ukraine. March 24th is one, but there have been several since then. The U.S. administration has lost interest and engagement in the Russian-Ukrainian war, and Stephen Witkoff, who was the major negotiator for President Trump, has been also a major negotiator in the Iran war. Attention now is on Iran, the length of the war, the international situation with oil. And we see the economic consequences in the price of oil globally and in stock market volatility. The defeat of Prime Minister Orban in Hungary is significant. And as I said last night, even though Orban is still in his last few days as prime minister, they did surrender that veto, and now a loan will go through from the European states, will go through to Ukraine, which he was holding up unilaterally. The new prime minister, Magyar, is limited in how much he can change the Hungarian posture, because there still are quite a few Orban supporters that are embedded in the government. So it's not going to change overnight, but it will be some change. And one of them was that loan is no longer held up. What is likely to happen in Ukraine in the near future? I will give you a few alternatives here. Alternative one, the war drags on the way it is now. Both sides lose more men. Russia gets a little more territory and consolidates what it has. Europe continues to give aid. Prior to yesterday, European aid was about 197 billion. United States was 188 billion. These are rough estimates. And the big loan went through last night, so that'll go to Ukraine soon. The United States has made no new appropriations in 2026, but there are some monies and supplies from earlier appropriations. And there is humanitarian aid going on all the time toward Ukraine. I don't know about you, but I get at least one solicitation a week to give to Ukraine through one charity or another. Ukraine is hanging in there and making some strikes against Russia, some quite deep into the country, but the situation is unresolved. Ukraine's position is weaker, but their determination is great. So that's alternative one. Alternative two, Russia and Ukraine might negotiate a peace treaty with either Europe or the United States, or both as brokers. I think Europe will want to be included given the investment it's made. In this scenario, Russia keeps all the land acquired, Crimea and the 4 provinces of eastern Ukraine, where they've already given Russian citizenship to those people. Ukraine would have to promise to be neutral in return for security guarantees from the West. Ukraine would not be able to join NATO. And Russia may insist on a change of government in Ukraine at the top. I don't know that it will insist on it, but it's likely it will insist on it. The Great Decisions case study, written before all this mess in the world, he had another alternative. I'll just focus on that briefly so you see what it was. And that was a future in which Ukraine would win. And he posited that it could play the role in Eastern Europe comparable to Israel's in the Middle East, independent, strong, feisty, following its own path. Circumstances have changed, of course, and this alternative future is highly unlikely. I think the most likely alternative is the alternative two, a brokered peace agreement in which a weakened, diminished Ukraine would survive as a neutral state with Western guarantees. Excuse me, I jumped 2 things. Situation currently faces a lot of unknowns. The length and status of the war with Iran is one. The intensity of Russian incursions into Ukraine. The nature of the Ukrainian air attacks on Russia. The ability of Ukraine to regain the attention of the United States. Russia has had some relief to its economy because some of the oil sanctions have been lifted as a result of the Mideast war. That means less pressure on Putin. And that, along with the shifting attention, means that he is a winner in the Mideast war. I personally am not optimistic about a solution for Ukraine in the near future. Now, having said that, I'd like to shift gears and give you a little bit of history of Russia and Ukraine as they have interacted over the centuries. We in the United States get very little history of Eastern Europe. And so most people, unless they have studied that area, don't get too much background in it. Let me just give you a little bit of background on the Russian-Ukrainian situation, both in recent times and long ago. Okay. Ukraine was a republic of the USSR until December 1991, when the USSR broke up. Okay. In Russian history, for much of Russian history, the Russians have considered Ukraine a part of Russia. And the word Ukraina means at the border. U is at, and Krai is border. So the country's name is at the border. So I'm giving you a Russian conception of this. Russians had to accept the breakup of the Soviet Union as a fact of history, but especially lamented it as it considered all of this as part of the historic Russian Empire. Forget the communists, forget the Soviet period. A lot of Russians, including a man who now is president, Vladimir Putin, had a very romantic view of the Russian Empire going back to the 19th century. And in particular, they looked at the countries that had Slavic populations, languages that were very, very close, and cultures that were very, very close. And the closest of the close were Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. The origins of Russia and Ukraine are intertwined going back to Kievan Rus in the Middle Ages. Rus was a country in the Middle Ages, and the capital was Kiev. Vladimir of Novgorod, a medieval prince, was part of the ruling Viking dynasty. He was the Prince of Novgorod. His father ruled from Kiev. His various brothers ruled from all over the place. Okay. He was, I think, one of the youngest of the family. His brothers and father died, and Vladimir was left as heir to Kievan Rus. He was not a legitimate son of the head of Kievan Rus. He was from a Ukrainian peasant woman. His father was the ruler of Kievan Rus, located, headquartered in Kiev. His mother was a Ukrainian servant. And he, of course, was an heir to the Viking dynasty, but part of the Viking dynasty. So was Vladimir Russian? That's Prince of Novgorod. Was he Scandinavian? He lived a lot of his life in Scandinavia. Or was he Ukrainian? Or was he all three? All three traditions that take him. Okay, he's either Volodymyr of Ukraine, Vladimir of Russia, or a Viking, Vladimir. The origins of Russia and Ukraine are intertwined going back to Kiev and Bruce. Thus, Ukraine was, through much of its history, partly or wholly in the Russian Empire. Sometimes it was independent. There were a lot of shifts in wars, etc. Russians tend to emphasize the periods when they were one country or mostly one country. Ukrainians tend to emphasize the periods that they were separate countries or mostly separate countries. After World War I, Ukraine, along with Poland, were among the countries that had to be handled in the peace process. Ukraine had been part of Austria-Hungary and part of the Russian Empire. Poland had been part of the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire. Ukraine was not dealt with adequately in the Paris peace talks. It was set free from the Russian Empire, but not much attention was paid to it. Okay. And after a few years, it collapsed and became part of the Soviet Union. It was defeated by the Soviet Union in the Russian Civil War after the Bolshevik Revolution, and Ukraine became part of the USSR in 1922. After World War II, when the Soviet Union basically took territory from the defeated German rule and defeated Austrians, etc., part of Poland, part of Hungary, and part of Moldova were absorbed into the Ukrainian Federal Republic. Now, along with this, in the 19th century, there were many intellectual movements in Russia. One of them was the Slavophiles. And the Slavophiles were the people who praised all of the Slavic traditions. And so these people tended to look at the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, and the Russians as one Slavic people and romanticized it. When World War I broke up the various empires, and as I said, with the settlements of Paris and Versailles, Ukraine was not dealt with as fully as it should have been. We now realize this in retrospect. Poland was dealt with very, very well. And one Ukrainian scholar who is at Harvard posited that he thinks the reason for that was that the head of Poland was Paderewski, the famous pianist and composer, and that he got the attention of the other powers at Paris and Versailles, whereas Ukraine did not have a stellar leader of that character. But many problems that we deal with in the late 20th century and the early 21st century go back to the Peace of Versailles and the Paris Peace Accords. Ukraine had a turbulent history within the USSR from 1922 to 1991. It was after Russia, the most populous republic, and it suffered very, very greatly in the purges. Many, 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 many people perished during the purges because Ukraine was agriculturally very strong, the grain belt of Russia, Soviet Union. During World War II, some of the Ukrainians wanted to leave with the Germans, but the Germans shot them down. And so they realized that the Germans were as bad as the Soviets. Nonetheless, some Ukrainians escaped during World War II and eventually wound up in other countries. And one of the notable countries that they went to is Canada. And Canada has a huge Ukrainian population. And in fact, Ukrainian, I think, is one of the major languages of Canada. Ukraine always was closely tied to Russia in its culture, its religion, and its Slavic heritage. It was also the grain belt, the source of agricultural supplies, especially wheat. And it was the source of numerous leaders. So in the mature Soviet Union, the Soviet Union of the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s, a lot of the people in Moscow in the leadership were originally from Ukraine, starting with Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and their associates all came up to. So Ukraine had a feeling that it co-ruled the USSR. And that attitude prevails into the post-Soviet period. Once the Soviet Union broke up at the end of 1991, Russia went from superpower to regional power. And as a regional power, it wanted to maintain ties with the former Soviet republics, and it created what it called the Commonwealth of Independent States. Not everybody agreed to join in it, but I think 9 of the former states agreed initially to join. And Russia adopted very early on what it called the Monroe Doctrine, the Monroskaya Doktrina. And they called those countries that were contiguous with Russia the near abroad. They didn't call them foreign countries. They called them the near abroad. And in particular, they wanted close ties with Belarus and Ukraine, with, of course, Russia leading this triumvirate. Well, Belarus acquiesced, and Belarus remains perhaps the closest single country to Russia at the present time, with Kazakhstan a close second. With Ukraine, there was cooperation, but not subordination, because Ukraine had not forgotten their almost co-equal status among the leadership during the last days of the USSR, and they could not agree to be subordinate to Russia. They thought they were equal to Russia. By and large, through the 90s and so on, Ukraine had governments that were mostly, I say, friendly to Russia. And then there was the Orange Revolution of 2004, 2005, and a pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian, pro-European government briefly. The next few years saw seesawing as Ukraine tried to balance its ties with Europe and its ties with Russia. In 2010, Yanukovych, who is from eastern Ukraine, that part that's heavily Russian influenced, came to power, and he tipped the balance toward Russia. And they don't think that he tipped the balance toward Russia because he felt he was Russian, but because Russia was offering them a better deal at the time. And then in 2014, there was a second wave of uprisings, the Maidan, and they toppled him. He has escaped to Russia, where he lives now. Since 2014, there have been a series of pro-Western governments in Ukraine, of which the latest is headed by Zelensky. Okay. The pro-Western governments tend to want to gravitate more toward Europe and away from Russia, more toward NATO, away from Russia, and Russia resists this, of course. Ukraine in NATO is Russia's worst nightmare. 2014, with the Maidan uprising, was a pivotal year, and during that time, Russia went in and captured Crimea and captured part of the eastern region of Ukraine. Now, you might say, why did they do that? In 1954, Ukraine was given Crimea by Khrushchev. Crimea, which actually is contiguous with Ukraine, had been part of Russia for several centuries. But Khrushchev, in his rise to power in the Communist Party, needed the support of various regional communist parties. And in order to get the support of the Communist Party of Ukraine, said, we'll give Ukraine Crimea. And the other leaders said to him, what are you talking about? You can't give Ukraine away. You can't give Crimea away. And he said, it's all one country. What difference does it make? Well, of course, in 1991, it was no longer one country. And so Crimea became part of Ukraine in 1991. In these incursions that occurred in 2014, which is really the first war, Russia seized a good part of the eastern Ukraine, as well as Crimea. There were talks in Minsk in 2015 among the European powers and Russia and Ukraine, and some settlements were achieved, sort of more or less the status quo with rules, but neither Ukraine nor Russia followed those guidelines. The United States was largely out of the Minsk agreements altogether. In the period between 2014 and 2022, Russia consolidated control in the eastern areas, little by little, quietly. And the West retaliated only with sanctions. So the sanctions were because Russia was expanding its control, but nobody was talking about military, etc. So the sanctions, particularly against Russian oil, were, they thought, enough. So the escalating sanctions the West thought were enough of a response. Analysts are now trying to go back and say, okay, when was it decided that they would go in and try to get all of Ukraine? And the decision right now is the analysis suggests that by early 2021, Russia had decided to try to take over all of Ukraine. After all, the West had not intervened. They had put sanctions, but Russia could live with those sanctions. And they think that by early 2021, the decision was made. In the summer of 2021, an article was published under Putin's name. Now, he probably did not write the article himself. It was a big article with a lot of historical research, but it reflects his views that of this Slavic brotherhood of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia's historic right to Ukraine. And that article was published under the president's name and very widely understood. Okay. And then gradually in the fall, you have that buildup that occurs. People now think that Russian intelligence underestimated the degree of opposition they would face from Ukraine and thought that this could be like a 1-week war or a 2-week war where they would take over all of Ukraine. Well, they invaded in the winter of February 2022, and the rest we know very well because the United States and Europe responded, helped Ukraine, etc. And Russia basically was thwarted in its goal. But meanwhile, it's been edging for greater control in the eastern section, and it has won some victories. It's done a lot of damage in the main Ukraine, but it has not captured Ukraine. Thus, the war really began in 2014 and then continued with a new, bigger, more widespread war in 2022. Okay. Thus, coming back to the central question, the topic of European security and Ukraine in this historical context, I would say, sort of in conclusion, the following. NATO and European Union are two different bodies. Their membership is not the same. So you cannot equate European security with the two bodies. And those who think that European economic cooperation is the same as European military cooperation have a lot to learn. It's one thing to agree on standards for cheese that is to be exported. It's another thing to agree on standards for armies. Each country has its own security and military apparatus and its own priorities. So the idea of an all-European security would be a new conception besides NATO. NATO is obviously a partially all of Europe, but not all of Europe. Okay. What of the future? As we sit here now at the end of April, I'm not optimistic for Ukraine. Ukraine's population is about 37 million plus. Russia is a population of 146 million plus. In both countries, there's a shortage of men. When last counted, Ukraine had about 17 million women, 20 million women and 17 million men. Russia has 65.8 million men and 77.2 million women. Both have gender gaps going back to World War II. But still, 65 million men to 17 million men is a significant gap. So, to conclude there, where are we? Where are we going? It's hard to say. And I'd like to stop sharing and open our discussion. And I'll turn it back to Kay for her leadership.
Okay, well, we have several questions already.
Good.
First one's looking at does Trump's sanction vis-a-vis Russia regarding the allowance for sale of oil make any logical sense?
I think symbolically, it allows for countries to get oil from Russia. Yeah, so yes, it does. Yeah, so yeah, it does. And but it, of course, the side effect is it brings more income into Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, um, okay. I'm gonna go with another economic one question here. What is the status of releasing Russian funds held in US and European banks to Ukraine? Do you know anything on that?
I haven't followed that closely. There have been threats to do that, and the Europeans may have released some. I have real questions about that, in general, and how would we like our funds if they were in, let's say, a Canadian bank to be released by Canada?
Mm-hmm.
It could have long-term implications. So this is not a question that I have especially studied, but it's one that has always made me nervous.
Okay. Okay. Oh, talking about that disparity of men to women, are women fighting on either side in this war, especially the Ukraine? And would they not be counted within the dead, or do we just say men in general for the dead?
All the dead are counted. All the dead are counted, and so when we talk about losses between a quarter of a million, and a million, we're talking everybody, men, women, and children. Elderly, young, everybody. Uh, Whether women are officially fighting, I don't think officially they are. Unofficially, they are. Unofficially, they are. Theoretically, I think they aren't, but I think they, in reality, are. And I wouldn't be surprised if they will do the same as Israel. And I don't think that currently they draft all the women, but I think that they will. They will
Okay.
have to.
Okay.
The men are resisting the draft also in both countries, and they think that somewhere, possibly even up to a million Russian men have escaped the country. to avoid the draft, up to 1 million men. If they had a car and their families supported them, they left and they went to some place like Kazakhstan, which they can get to very easily. And Kazakhstan would not, repatriate them, but it's a Russia-friendly country with a heavy Russian population.
Okay. Um, Someone's wondering, isn't the US still providing very important intelligence aid to Ukraine, at least for now?
As far as I know, yes.
Okay.
As I know, yes. That's not something they widely share. In other words, it's all that's all supposition.
So, do you understand why Trump's word alone moves the market and followers, um, in terms of things like sanctions and stuff, when he has consistently not told the truth and or changes what he says constantly? So in terms of, um, even making demands on NATO, making demands on Russia or Ukraine.
Well, the market is very volatile to begin with, and we could spread a rumor today if we had the power that somehow the whole space program is going to close tomorrow morning. Okay? That would affect the market. So the market is very volatile. And I think that, when we invest in the stock market, one of the things we have to have is a lot of patience and strong nerves to not pay such close attention. The market is just very volatile. And
Mhm.
so when the president says, the price of oil will go down, they believe him, even if it goes up tomorrow. Yeah.
So, okay. Okay. This is just an interesting one. Would you see a similarity between Ukraine fighting against Russia and the colonies fighting against England? The way that fighting the enemy by dramatically changing to how we conduct attacks seems similar. Because it's like when we fought the Revolutionary War, it was by using changes of tactics because we had to.
Yeah. Well, I think that certainly Russia looks at Ukraine as a colony. So that the analogy is not absurd. The analogy, I mean, Russia
Mhm.
looks at Ukraine as part of Russia, and that would be as a colony. And the very fact that it's called at the border,
Mhm.
Ukraina means on the border. And there might be some people who would look, but and so that because their histories have been intertwined in and out, etc. And I can remember even when I was in graduate school, the Ukrainian students, some of whom were emigres who had come over fairly young, the Ukrainian graduate students would often be in opposition to what their professors were teaching in the classes because they thought that the professors were taking more the Russian perspective rather than the Ukrainian perspective. Okay.
Okay. So, what do you think about the impact of changing tactics of warfare driven by drone technology? Is Ukraine or Russia more benefited?
Well, I think Ukraine is setting a model now for small countries to be able to resist. And some of the Gulf states have been buying, those drones. And even the Americans are using some of those drones I think in the Gulf War. I'm not positive on that. I think, war is changing. I think we may have war increasingly fought by drones rather than by humans.
So, I mean, do you think this impacts Russia's impetus to think about going into any other countries if it's going to be like this has taken 4 years versus 2 weeks? If you think about the impact of how much longer this war is taking than Russia probably initially thought.
Yeah,
Um,
well, that as it's believed that generally Putin got bad intelligence data, in 2021, that he was told what he wanted to hear rather than what was the reality. And it's true in all countries. The intelligence people sometimes tell the leader what they want to hear rather than what is the reality. But they also were maybe listening to people who were more pro-Russian than the people that were more pro-Ukrainian. I don't know. Uh, Putin is a long-term thinker.
Okay.
And I don't know what his long-term agenda is. Certainly they have, when you look at Ukraine, this has been going on since 2014, 2022. And so, but, they've gotten now 20% of the country plus Crimea, which they got back. And so I don't know what it means. Certainly, the other countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union are very nervous about everything. The former Soviet states were very nervous, and those that bordered Soviet Union were very nervous. So it's hard to say. The other thing is Putin will be 73. Or 74. I forget, one or the other. He is 73 or 74. I think he was born in 1952, which would make him 74 in October. He's not a youngster. He supposedly has a number of ailments, although some of these are exaggerated and some of them come from Ukrainian sources, so they're not so reliable. Some of the things that we hear about his health are not so reliable. But he's not unique in what he thinks. I mean, he reflects a lot of Russians who believe that Ukraine is part of Russia in Russian history. It may or may not be accurate and historically perfectly accurate, but if you believe it, then it's accurate, for you.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question. How Ukrainian are the Russian-speaking residents of the Donbas area?
Oh, it varies, because some of them, are in families that have intermarried and, they're like partly this and partly that. And some others maybe are purely Russian. We would have to be able to live there with that. My guess is a lot of these people are just as happy to be part of Ukraine. And even some recent interviews that I've seen from some of the people there, they don't trust Ukraine. They feel they were mistreated in Ukraine. And that's the Russian, by the way, the Russian justification. They say that these people were mistreated. Now, they exaggerate that, of course, just as anybody would exaggerate it who wanted to make that as a cause. But that's very hard to say because some of them have intermarried with Ukrainians. Some of them may be Russian, but still feel they want to be part of Ukraine. Some of them may be Ukrainian, but feel that they want to be part of a greater, a larger country. So it will vary. And there's no way for us to really know that.
Okay. Someone even notes here that initially Putin said he invaded Ukraine because of the anti-Semitism, even though Zelensky himself is Jewish. Has he given up on that rationale and instead focuses now on?
That particular rationale was the anti-Ukrainian. He kept saying they were anti-Russian mostly. And
Okay.
the anti-Semitism and the fascism is something they throw in periodically. They go back to World War II when some of the Ukrainians sided with the Nazis, as I said, during the invasion. And they refer to the Nazi strains in Ukraine too, So they brought in anything that they could bring in. Yeah, but Zelensky is, as you say, Zelensky himself is Jewish. He is married to a woman who is Christian.
So, okay. This person says, from what I've heard, Ukraine is more technologically sophisticated than Russia. Is that true? And if so, how much of an advantage is that for the Ukraine?
I don't think so. Russia is very technologically sophisticated. Ukraine has developed highly now developed this drone and so on, but you could not say that Ukraine as a whole is more technically developed than Russia. Both are highly developed technologically.
Yes, in terms of that drone, just type March 27th, 2026 PBS NewsHour
Yes, you
into a
should be able
search engine and it will bring up
it should be
links
able to
to the
bring it in, yeah.
video.
Now I don't have great luck with Passport. I'm a member, but I don't have great luck.
Well, it is on YouTube also.
Oh,
It's
yes, I'm gonna
posted on YouTube.
yeah,
So
March
that's why,
27th. Yeah, it was one of the segment. You have to listen to others, before you get to that segment. If you're looking at the whole segment, it was, sort of like in the second half of the hour, I think. Mhm. But
so
it was
yeah,
a big
just
segment. It was a big segment, so it was not an itsy bitsy little thing. It was big.
right. So I just recommend type in, write that date down and then type that into your search engine and
You'll
you'll
be okay.
find that video on that. Um, okay. Before we get to a meteor question, someone asked, what information does Putin have over Trump that makes Trump not want to support Ukraine? How can Putin destroy Trump's image? Any of it related to Epstein files? Um, but I'm just thinking, it's like, does Putin have any hold over Trump, or is it that Trump admires Putin?
Well, there's been that speculation back, since 2015. That speculation has been out there, and nobody knows for sure anything. The uh, I'm more inclined to think, that when Trump ran the first time, he raised we did not have, prior to 2014, our relations with Russia had improved considerably, and they worsened somewhat after the 2014 but I think that he felt we could have good relations. He seems to admire Putin as an individual at the moment. I don't know that he would admire him on the long term. He ebbs and flows in his admiration. But I would tend to agree that if back then I would have agreed too. There is no reason why we can't have better relations with Russia. Uh, and I think we have tended to ignore some opportunities, just as they ignored some opportunities. I don't put the blame on either side. I do lectures on all the mistakes that occurred, in between. So I don't put the blame on either side, but we could have when you have diplomatic relations, you don't have to love the other partner. You don't have to agree totally with the other partner. You're doing business with them.
Hmm.
So whether it is with the Chinese, with the leader of India, with the leader of Argentina, with the leader of Canada, you're working with them on a business-like basis. So I think you can do business with any country. That would be my posture.
Hey, you are muted.
I muted myself. Sorry. Okay. So double checking on the PBS NewsHour segment. Was that March 27th, 2026?
Yeah.
Okay. And that was PBS NewsHour. I just sent out a chat thing to everyone that gives you the date and the name of the show because somebody was asking what was the news name. And that's what it is. So it's over in chat to everyone. You can check there. Okay. Someone's also wondering, will there be a summary available after the lecture, or is this available for viewing? Yes, this is being recorded, and it will be available on the Ollie YouTube website and also on the Ramsey County Library events and programs, probably be up within the next week. Not immediately after the class, but it will be up there. Okay, next question. Do you have any idea who might be Putin's successor?
No, because it'll be somebody from the inner circle, and there's a fairly large inner circle in the cabinet, the political advisors, etc. So if Putin were to drop dead tomorrow, I could not tell you who would be. There would be not, a normal successor. Temporarily, the prime minister would probably take over, because that's the way the system is set up. But that doesn't mean who, there would have to be a presidential election held shortly thereafter. But no, they have been very careful not to show who are the top influencers.
Right. Kind of like with some countries, we see people being groomed, but this is
This is not a case.
definitely, yeah, this is definitely not one of those cases. I don't see him wanting to share any
No,
spotlight with anyone.
share the spotlight. No.
Um, okay, for someone to just ask, why was Ukraine not included in negotiations? Which negotiations would be my question.
That would
Um,
be my question too. Which negotiation? Yeah. There
so if
were
you could clarify on that one, that
yeah,
would
there were
be
some negotiations that temporarily between Russia and the United States only about Ukraine, but that was very brief. There
so
were only United States and Russia. And then there were some that were Ukraine, Russia, and United States. There were some held in Turkey that were Ukraine, Russia, and Turkey. So there's been a whole lot of negotiations. But there were some that were United States and Russia only, but they were brief.
so hopefully that answered your question. If it didn't, please clarify further. Um, so currently, no questions in there. Oh, wait, one just came in. Is Trump's main interest in good relations with Russia motivated by how much his family could profit from business interests? That's an
I
interesting.
would hesitate to say, but that seems to be a motivation in a number of countries.
So,
That seems to be a rather important, particularly in the Middle East. It's a very important motivation. With Saudi Arabia, it seems to be quite an important one.
yes, I mean, Trump has not said that he's planning on building a hotel on the Crimea at any point in time, as he has on some other locations. But yeah, it would be, I think anything economic motivates Trump if it
Mhm.
benefits him. That's my opinion, does not have to be yours. Any other questions, anyone? We have. Oh, can you comment on Russia's economic achievements given its resources? As a, I'm gonna guess you mean currently. Do they have economic achievements given its resources and the disruption with sanctions? That would be.
Okay, sure. Russia is a highly developed country, but the consumer goods industries have often lagged behind. With the sanctions, which began after 2014, Russia had to turn to do more domestic production. So, kind of a side effect of the sanctions was actually beneficial to the Russian economy because they had to now produce at home some of the things that they used to import. Just as in some ways COVID was beneficial to the United States, and that we had to produce at home some of the things that we used to import. It's hard to say that COVID was beneficial, but it can be that out of tragedy comes something, because a lot of things, for example, let me just give you one example of the United States. Initially, we didn't have to wear masks when COVID came. And some people said, well, how come they imposed it later? There were not enough masks in this country to wear. So they couldn't say wear masks because there weren't enough masks. There were barely enough masks for the doctors and nurses. And so if we started to buy some of those masks, there wouldn't be enough for the doctors and nurses who would need it more than we did. So initially, they did not require masks. They required masks once we started to make masks. But Russia was in a similar situation that they didn't have a lot of domestic products that they needed. They started with the sanctions when they couldn't import them to develop them themselves. So there were some side benefits to the sanctions. Another thing to remember is that not all the countries follow the sanctions. Okay? And I think about a year ago, it was reported just among American companies that were 150 or so that were not observing the sanctions. India is a major country that is not observing the sanctions against Russia. So let us say Europe cannot buy oil from Russia, but they can buy oil from India. India is buying that oil from Russia. So Europe can say, well, we're not buying any Russian oil. No, because they're buying it from India. And India's. So the sanctions, let's just say, are not totally observed. Then there is, for the wealthy within Russia, anything they want that they can get. For example, let's say that you and I were Russian billionaires, okay? And we decide our Mercedes needs to be replaced. We could just call some firm in the Middle East and say, I want a new Mercedes and I want it here by next week. They would drive it to us by next week and we would pay whatever the premium is for that delivery. So there's a lot of violations of the sanctions. But when you hear that a lot of American businesses even were violating the sanctions and nothing was done about it, you get the idea. Let alone countries that are ignoring the sanctions. The countries that pay lip service to the sanctions are mostly our European allies, but they're buying from countries that don't pay attention to the sanctions. And we probably are too. We are probably doing that too.
Okay. Didn't Ukraine have territorial guarantees when it gave up its nuclear armaments?
Oh,
Why
yes.
should it
Yes.
now trust
Yes.
guarantees in a peace process?
Yes. Ukraine had all sorts of guarantees, but that was 30 years ago. How many administrations, American administrations, was that ago? For the Russians, it's not that many administrations ago, but for the Americans, it's a lot of administrations ago. And one of my friends said she thinks that any agreement the United States makes is probably not followed after 10 years whatsoever. Sort of said this globally. I don't know that that's correct, but it's as good an estimate as any, I suppose. Yes, yes. And Ukrainians who are, when they're told that if there's a peace agreement, the West will guarantee their security, they all come back to 1994 and say, well, what about those agreements then? Yeah, they're worthless.
Mm-hmm.
Worthless.
Someone's wondering, what about a successor for Zelensky? And we kind of addressed that in terms of if Russia
Yeah,
wins.
if Russia, yeah, Zelensky probably the price will be that he will have to resign. Oh, there are plenty of Ukrainians, but I don't know of anybody who stands out. And it might not be anybody who's high profile or even has a high position now, because the Russians might insist that it be somebody who hasn't played a very, very visible role in the war. Yeah. So it could be anybody whatsoever. Yeah. But Zelensky should have had presidential elections, I think either 24 or 25. And because of the war, he postponed them. So among other things, the Russians point out that Zelensky is in power, beyond his term. Not that the Russians are such great observers of these legalities, but they observe that.
Mm-hmm. And last question here. It's like, what's the difference between Biden's son and Trump's family in foreign investments, especially in the Ukraine? Probably not a lot.
I have no idea, because I have no idea. None of us have really any idea of the depth to which any of them are involved in these economic deals. They don't exactly publicize them. I know that Jared got $2 billion from the Saudis from his business. So for Jared, we know that the Saudi connection is very strong, and he got some questions the other day. But President got some questions about this the other day. That why was Jared in some of the negotiations when Jared gets money from some of these foreign countries for his business? And the president danced around that issue, not very well, but he danced around it and managed to evade an answer. I would say probably no difference, but we don't know the depths of which either family is involved, really.
Hmm. So, well, it is now 11:30 and our time is up. It just kind of flew there. It's been so informative and just I appreciated the historical context too here of today that I think really makes you understand why conflicts occur when you can understand the historical background of that. So I appreciate you sharing all of your knowledge, Norma. It's just been a really, I'd say, informative day, and I appreciate that. So I want to thank all of you for your great questions, for your comments. We appreciate that, and um, yeah, so they said they appreciate the class being offered online
I see that.
and
Yeah, I
being
see
able
that.
to participate. Lots of thank yous rolling in for you, Norma, and it's yeah, it's been a privilege to be able to listen to you today. So I want to thank everyone once again. Thank Ollie for making this recording possible. And I want to say go out, enjoy the sunshine today, and um, and come back next month when we have our next great decisions. Thanks,
Good.
everyone.
Good. Thank you all. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.